Hey, this is Max from GraphCDN, and we're currently doing a couple of team interviews to introduce you to some of the great people that we have on the team. Today's guest is Phil Plu, one of our software engineers who previously worked at Formidable Labs and is probably, if you're in the React ecosystem, if you're an engineer in the React ecosystem, you might know him for either maintaining and being on the core team of Style Components or being on the core team of Urkel, some of the really big open source projects that he's worked on. Phil, I'm excited that I get to chat with you today. We've worked a lot in open source before together, and now we get to work together at a company as well, which is really exciting. What is your story? If you had to tell sort of in broad strokes, how did you get from growing up to being at GraphCDN? What was your journey like?
Wow. I mean, the one constant you've already mentioned is Style Components. So I'm sure some people are connecting the dots. Max Stoiber. Style Components. It's all making sense now. But I actually didn't get into open source because of Style Components. And before that, a lot of what kind of got me into it was, as for many people, just React in general, which is, I mean, how do people call it these days? The front-end renaissance until the next big thing comes around. Who knows? It's lasted for a while. I think before then, I was really working on a lot of state management things. And that's when open source really started to interest me because people were exploring so many different things at the same time. Depending on who you ask, my dark past or my glorious past is RxJS, and I've done a lot of things with that. And it was super fascinating to me because observables and stream patterns in Rx are so popular with some, and at the same time so unpopular with others. So that's kind of where I've come from. Let's do what I've done after. My time at, I eventually moved to London, where I actually picked up tech jobs. So I moved for work, really. Did various things, like, apart from maintaining Style Components, I made a font. People might know me for Deg Mono. Made some other libraries, and then eventually I worked on Urkel at Formidable. So that's when GraphQL got big. And I saw the same patterns emerge as with React when it first came around.
What brought you into programming in the first place? Did you go to university?
I did go to university, but not for very long. I was working on open source already. I was doing a lot of kind of web development at the time. So I eventually dropped out when I got a job in London. So I was working part-time already as a React developer specifically. But before that, I've kind of done some freelancing when I was still in school. So I've always been self-taught in terms of front-end development and web development. And I think things just sped up so much with React and with the demand around creating more complex front-end apps at the time, that I just saw that as a much more interesting space to go down to rather than formal education.
I very much felt the same way. When I started studying, you have to take these intro classes to computer science, and you have to learn about binary numbers, you have to learn about algebra, you have to learn about how processors work. And I'd already coded a little bit of HTML and CSS at the time, and I sort of started to learn a little bit of JavaScript, and I was like, I just want to make more websites. I just want to sit there. I really enjoy this process of creating something from nothing. I really enjoy this process of making things. And then I had to go to university and I had to calculate with binary numbers. And I was like, this is not what I want to do. This is absolutely not what I care about, right? I really, really care about making things. And I actually, in hindsight, looking back now, years later, I do actually think that going to university can be really valuable. And I've sort of had to do just-in-time learning. I actually talked about this with Thomas as well. I feel like I've had to learn things at the right moment. And the difficulty is that I didn't know what was even out there, right? Because I never got the baseline fundamentals from university. I had to figure out what even exists out there that I could learn from, so that at the point when I needed it, I knew that I needed that thing that already somebody had solved before. And I think that sometimes slowed me down, but also let me really do what I enjoy the most. And it let me focus on learning things when I needed to, which I thought was really powerful.
Yeah, how many resources were out there anyway, right? There's so much out there right now. I feel like when we're talking about the things that have happened in web development, there's so many good things that have happened. Standards have evolved, new libraries have popped up, new techniques and new ideas have popped up. But I think it all kind of exploded and exponentially. And when you kind of extrapolate this back to this one point, what did you have? Like you had Stack Overflow, you had W3C schools, like MDN wasn't really that good yet and just got big. It was just an exciting time. There were there weren't a lot of resources around, but one thing that can be said is it was a lot easier to decide what you're going to read because you weren't overwhelmed with any options. Right now, you go through boot camps as well. Right now, you have so many online web tutorials in video form and text form. So I think it's a different situation right now. But how I see it in terms of comparing it to formal education is, there's a lot of interesting things that I've learned in my short time at university, and those weren't linear algebra and other mathematics, like higher mathematics, which I basically repeated from it just felt like secondary school all over again, but make it harder. Just turn it up a notch so more people drop out. But for context, I went into a course of studies that had, I think over 1,000 people signed up in that first semester. And it was unheard of at the time, and I didn't even realize. And so they had to, well, bluntly said, get rid of people. So they weren't too interested in making things easy, but there were other nice courses in there around the basics of computing, the basics of processors and processor architecture. Those were really interesting. And as someone who has often enjoyed learning these things on their own, like learning these things on my own would have been pretty difficult, but not impossible. What that's about is discovery, I think. So, and it's pretty similar with web development. Things didn't used to be as discoverable as they are now, but there used to be good teachers around every corner, and it was a lot about personal connection. And not that that's gone right now, but right now there's an abundance of kind of set routes that you can take and accelerate the boring stuff, so to speak.
I think there's another element to this where the web development world in particular is still, even though it's slowed down, still moves so quickly that universities' curriculums don't really keep up, right? I don't know of a curriculum that teaches you CSS as well as, for example, Josh Comeau does, right? I don't know of a curriculum that teaches you how to build a full stack web app with JavaScript as well as Wes Bos does, right? These people are absolute experts in their field, and they make courses around specifically their expertise, and they're just at the forefront of the forefront, and they're bringing that knowledge back to everybody else. And on top of that, they're really good teachers. Those two people that I just called out, and many others as well, they're just really, really good teachers. And so you can learn from these experts, and they can explain their thinking process much better than anybody at a different university could do who just happens to teach a course about web development. They're never going to be as much on the forefront and as deep in the topic as a Wes Bos or a Josh Comeau or a Kenzie Dodds would be.
Yeah, it's not, I don't even want to say it's novel, right? Because books are a thing, used to be a thing, right? Not too long ago, Manuel B, I think, published his book on React, which also includes a chapter on hooks. And the interesting thing, this aha moment for me was, well, yeah, you can still write about that. Like, duh, you can still write about these topics. It's just, it was the most recent book at the time. There are books coming out all the time, and they used to be a pretty popular source of information. But I think the interesting thing about other courses is that people have also found ways to make material that is new and exciting and engaging in different ways. So we're just catering for more ways of learning. Not that not everyone is into teaching these things to themselves, but not everyone likes to learn with the same methods and in the same ways. Maybe we like to just jump in and try something out and then read up as we go, kind of brute force method, but other people may enjoy a different pace or a different technique.
Absolutely. So you sort of stopped studying university when you moved to London and got your first job as a developer. What was your journey like from there? How did that first job go? And then where did you go next?
I don't want to say the first job was terrible, but it is the job that got me to move to London, where I still live. And I'm very grateful for that. And it was a startup, so things were messy. First time founders that weren't really dedicated to making the company work, but were more dedicated towards their vision, which is not a bad thing. but they didn't really know how to deal with roadblocks at the time. And it was interesting being in that situation and trying to be engaged and help out. Ultimately, it didn't really work out, and that's when I went to a larger company, which is called Trainline. They do train ticketing all over Europe now. At the time, it was just the UK. Then they acquired a company in Paris, and they kind of expanded to coaches, so buses and rail across Europe as well. And that was nice. I got to kind of participate in building an app from scratch, because there was a kind of re-architecture effort ongoing. They started using React for their mobile web app, and then they wanted to use it for their full desktop web app. And remember companies making mobile web apps and desktop web apps? Oh, great times. Great times. No, it was already backwards when they did it. It was just the easiest way for them to go about it.
Is that where you learned React?
No, I learned React years before that. So that was in 2016, and I was at the startup. When I was at the startup, I think I started working for the startup in London 2015, and I eventually moved mid 2016. Before that, I had a couple of smaller jobs in Berlin where I lived before.
Makes sense. So you're at the train line, the company's re-architecting their desktop web app, which already means they have the wrong level of abstraction, but they're re-architecting their desktop web app to React. Is that what eventually led you to styled components?
It was. We're looking into so many different solutions to CSS and JS. And at the time, I think I was really into what's now React. Well, it was React Look. By Robin, you might know him. And it was, I think, the best solution at the time. But there were a lot of different constraints once you start to go about it in a team that has different levels of experiences and expectations when it comes to styling. And there were different levels of expectations as well around code sharing between the desktop web and the mobile web app. So there were a lot of different ideas around there. Theming just became relevant, and everything seemed like no one really had an idea of what was important. And style components was just more focused at the time. It was too early, though, to use it there. I'm pretty sure we settled on using Aphrodite. Wow, what a throwback. If that says anything to anyone, you're the CSS and JS OG, right?
The Khan Academy Aphrodite, classic library at the time. I think at the time when we created style components, I remember that there was maybe Aphrodite and JSS and React Look. And that was kind of the entire landscape. Like, that was just what people used. And then, of course, there was CSS modules, which was sort of the dominant solution at the time.
A lot of different things. And we had, I think, long discussions around that. The other thing was obviously state management and Redux.
Of course.
I remember the things we were arguing about back then seem so interesting to me today. I was just recently reflecting on someone was trying to convince me that every single bit of state in the app should be in Redux because of the time traveling and because of the debuggability, because you can replay everything. And I was vehemently against that, and I saw the benefits. But on the other hand, it is interesting what we try to do that also broke React in a way, right? Broke state being isolated to different parts. And it evolved, right? Because then we were talking about forms, and in forms it kind of made sense. And then later on, all of these discussions kind of disappeared one by one. And then now with React hooks, they're kind of gone, thank God. It is interesting. I think people sometimes forget about these discussions around state that we used to have that are now so much easier. You can still argue about which libraries to use, but they all embrace the same principles and the same recipes that work, namely splitting up state and keeping it very granular. But yeah, monolithic state was interesting at the time.
I think that's something that I always was confused by when people talked about the whole state management thing, because to me, React was always two things, right? People say that React is a framework. It really isn't, right? React really does two things. It syncs stuff to the DOM, right? You have this declarative declaration of what the DOM should look like, and it makes sure that the DOM matches what you've declared, and it manages state. And that's kind of all that React does, but it does those two pieces, right? It manages state. It has to, because otherwise, where does the state come from for your DOM? It needs to know about the state. And that's really the two only things that React did for a very long time. And there was always this discussion around state management that was always a little bit strange, right? And it feels like the community kind of veered super far into the Flux Redux direction for a few years and was like, everything needs to be Flux or in Redux or like in a central monolithic store. And now the pendulum sort of swung back where it's like, actually, most things should probably be component local state because only that one component cares about it.
Mm-hmm. I had a blog post around that as well that I wrote not too long ago at Formidable, so like about a year ago now, which is called Not All Components Are Created Equal. And that is that exact same idea again, in that we also try to separate what components are and what categories of components there are for so long. Because if you accept granular state, you also have to accept that there are different kinds of components that do different things. And that's the thing, right? There is a differentiation between a global state or data. I just like to call it data, and local state, UI state. Although sometimes it's not just UI state, right? Because you propagate up and down. And to me, that's so interesting because GraphQL has kind of come in and has made this split very clear. I think it's so interesting of a topic because it gives people a clear idea of, okay, this is API state. It just becomes data that flows into my app. I have these queries, I have these fragments, it all flows down, and then I have my UI state. And it all just syncs up really nicely. And I think when people talk about, well, but like GraphQL is hard when you're individual, that's because it does introduce a couple of extra steps to make this separation very clear. And it's kind of sad to me when I see that in a lot of apps, people are still starting out writing monolithic big queries instead of composing them because they're missing out on this idea. They're trying to work around this idea. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with opting out of it. But I think GraphQL is so interesting with React specifically, or with componentized UI libraries. I got that right. Componentized UI libraries, because it hooks in so nicely into providing just data for your components.
I agree. What actually brought you to GraphQL? Were you using that at the train line as well?
No, that was... when did GraphQL actually get very popular? I don't even know.
I think, that if I remember correctly, they launched it in 2016, maybe?
I believe so, yeah. 2016 was when it got really public, but not quite as widely adopted yet. I believe I must have started using it in 2018, maybe even end of 2017. I wouldn't be quite sure anymore. We were working at Formidable with Lego at the time, and I'm so glad I can finally say that because they announced it publicly. Otherwise, I would have had to say Danish toy company, and who knows who that is. No one would have any idea. And yeah, that's when I kind of got into GraphQL, and there were already colleagues at Formidable who are more familiar with GraphQL. Shout out to Imran Sulemanji, who was really into it. And it was exciting because there was a lot of space still for questions to be open and to be explored, but a lot of things were already figured out. It's like one of these things where, like in CSS and JS, when you just looked at it 3 months after style components and suddenly you had 20 options. Like you have a lot of ideas and patterns to pick from, but it's all there already. So that's kind of, I think, the phase that I entered GraphQL at. Everything was there, but it was not really narrowed back down.
So where did Urkel come from? You were working at Formidable on the Lego at Formidable for Lego. How did you come up with the idea to, as Formidable, create a new GraphQL client?
So we were using GraphQL in more and more projects at the time, and specifically whenever you're looking at a consultancy like that, we start projects frequently within a year at different clients in different environments. And that's a really unique position because it gives you a lot of data, a lot of input, and a lot of thoughts on what you're currently using or what you're doing right or wrong. So obviously you'll never go to a client a year later and you say, we have a better idea of how to build this now, how to solve your problems. You know that thing where this team was discussing this one problem for like 3 weeks? Yeah, we have a better answer now. Uh, if you're still working with them, obviously you kind of want to go share this with them. But you have this nice mini community in the company where you can talk to each other about all of the problems. And we saw problems in how we wanted to use GraphQL on the client side and kind of the constraints that we wanted. And they were not really fulfilled. And at the same time, Ken Wheeler, who was working a lot on open source at Formidable, he already had an experimental library. Like, look at how quickly I can make a toy GraphQL client that works better for React, right? And that kind of started this idea of like we can work on this and we can try other things to make it better, right? And we didn't really want to look at everything that was out there, and so we just decided, let's just see how far we can get.
What were those problems that you were trying to solve with Urkel? What did you run into with sort of the existing options where you were like, I think we can improve upon the state of the art right now?
There were several, and some of these were actually excluded from making them core design principles because they were solved just by kind of starting from scratch. And specifically, we were big fans of Apollo Client, and there was not really any way in which we would recommend our clients to use Relay. That was just a coincidence. I just think none of the teams we worked in were really up for adopting all of these opinions and patterns. So really, we had a bunch of different opinions, a bunch of different patterns in terms of how to build your, client-side React app, and we had to reconcile that with, okay, but this is how you use Apollo Client. And we're just not happy with the trade-offs. So we were not happy with, first of all, its size and performance at the time. We were not happy in customizing it. And we were kind of not happy with some of the API decisions. So separately from that, we didn't make that direct input into how we built Urkel, but we just tried, okay, but if we start with this from scratch and we break this down and we try to build a GraphQL client without looking at what the other things are doing, then what are we going to come up with?
You wrote a blog post recently about those core design principles you did end up adopting for Urkel. Can you walk us through those?
Yeah, I believe when we kind of go back and look at how we developed Urkel, the three things that stand out is that we kind of, like I said, developed it from first principles. So we wanted something that was novel and not inspired by other libraries. In general, that's something that I think is very important in open source. Obviously, you can always synthesize new things from the ideas you've picked up from other libraries. But when you're doing that and when you're just kind of taking in more and more from these libraries, there's a huge bias towards making the same thing with small tweaks. And the amount of conflicts you're going to get in terms of how you implement something is pretty painful when you do that, at least typically in general. And it's a lot more fun to just look at it from, okay, here we have a couple of ideas. Let's see how we do it. And hence the kind of second principle that we had was that we wanted to make it pretty unopinionated and flexible. And the reason for that was that we were foreseeing different changes in GraphQL that were not compatible with having a kind of opinionated client. We saw different needs in terms of caching because a lot of people were out there saying, well, a GraphQL client isn't complicated. You can just fetch your data. And then you're standing there and you're like, that's true, but also, and then that's kind of where you're starting with, okay, not everyone needs a fully normalized cache. We're not all here for complex state management. Shout out to Redux again. Sometimes it's really just, we get the thing, we display the thing, right? And apart from that, we were already seeing, well, okay, subscriptions have different protocols that are going to succeed. Today we were seeing, well, at the time we were seeing just WebSockets, and then, that came true. A couple of, I think that must have been then a year later, we're seeing GraphQL WS. We were seeing now even more kind of protocols. So we're already seeing, well, the intent is that everything's pretty protocol agnostic. And that's when we're kind of looking at Relay and Apollo, and we're going, well, Apollo links are very good at that. But why do they only apply to the control flow when we're sending the request? Why don't they apply to everything? Because caching is just control flow, and like kind of the deduping and events of sending GraphQL operations and receiving a result, that's just control flow. So that's kind of where we started looking into, well, how can we make it so extensible that everything that is part of that GraphQL flow is just plugins? So that's the third part. How do we make an intuitive API that can be extended? So yeah, that's the three core principles then. So we set on novel as in first principles, versatile as in unopinionated, flexible, and then the third one, intuitive. Intuitive when you extend it.
I think that certainly rings true with my experience of using Urkel. I've always enjoyed the ability to pick and choose which parts of the control flow I want to influence for the specific use case that I have, right? In some apps, I really needed normalized caching. I really needed to make sure that we could distribute the data to different queries in a normalized fashion. In other apps, it really doesn't matter, right? You really don't need that complexity. A document level cache is perfectly fine. The same thing applies to how do you fetch, right? Like with Urkel, I think what's so nice is that you can really, so like you said, extend the whole control flow from the moment the query is written to the moment the result comes back to your component. And I've actually used that quite a bunch. I've written a few exchanges that do stuff that I just needed. For example, I wrote like a schema exchange that just does local resolving from a schema locally because I needed that for testing, I think, or something like that. And it's so nice that I have that level of control over my GraphQL client, and I can influence the control flow in that way. Now, after you worked at Formidable, you obviously joined Graph CDN. Walk me through the decision to leave an agency and join really an early stage startup. You were the first employee to join, if I remember correctly, or at least you were in the first week of employees that joined. I'm pretty sure you're actually the first. What was that decision like, and how has that decision worked out, particularly compared to working at an agency where you're working with many different clients, compared to working on a product that is just one product? You don't have many different clients.
Yeah, this is the section where we go, yes, boss, this is great, boss. Great. No,
everything is awesome. It's a paradise here.
It is a paradise. No, I mean, I knew you at the time, and I saw that you started Graph CDN, and it didn't even come to mind that I would ask you, hey, do you want to chat about roles and what you're hiring for at the time? Because I was pretty happy at Formidable, and B, I, as I said, didn't make great experiences with early stage startups. And I kind of thought, from my perspective, I was kind of done with that part of my career of joining early stage things, because I've done that several times, and I thought that was an early career thing. Yeah, for several reasons, it wasn't really in the back of my head or even present. That was an option again. It's weird how sometimes you get this tunnel vision of like, oh, this is what you're going to do, and then you don't think of things. But that's kind of the situation I was in. So when we were then finally talking, I was actually thinking, well, what is it like working on GraphQL? Because I was doing a lot of GraphQL at the time. At Formidable, I transitioned into a very open source focused role. Specifically, I was still working as an individual contributor, helping out in several projects. But we're also trying out a more developer advocate focused role at the time. So I was doing a lot of open source, and specifically a lot of that time went into GraphQL and Urkel. And so that's the thing. It was a lot of GraphQL, but there can always be more, right? What if it's not part of your time, but all your time? And what intrigued me specifically about what we're doing now is that we're going at it from this kind of niche, this kind of section that no one has really explored yet. And we're talking about it a lot from the perspective of CDN caching. We're talking a lot about that kind of CDN layer, that kind of proxy layer. And that's not really, I think, what I saw first. The thing is just no one's really gone into that space and said, we are a CDN. Because you can go into that space, you can say we're a proxy and we do this and that and we're great at analytics and blah. But this idea of where is CDN is very powerful. Not only because of caching and because I'm very interested in GraphQL caching, but also because GraphQL very naturally is very information heavy. In a way, this introspectiveness of being able to just send this type name information and just having the queries, it's a bit redundant at times. But that redundancy allows you to do so much processing on that CDN layer. So you gain so many insights and potentially so many optimizations. And specifically, I was working a lot on thinking about GraphQL HTTP protocols at the time. And I was playing around with it a bit. And that's why I see the same space. Because the problem is, well, the protocol needs to be adopted. But you know what doesn't need to be adopted? A protocol between a client that supports that protocol and a CDN layer that already has it. Because I think we're also at a point where GraphQL is becoming more and more complicated. You will have more and more options. And I'm saying that not as in it's complicated right now. If anyone's thinking that, I don't think you are right. That's just my opinion. But it's gonna become more complicated because we're gonna have all of these great features like streaming updates and streaming lists and live queries and all of that stuff. That stuff is going to be hard. That stuff is going to give you a lot of options in terms of how you're going to do protocols. And obviously, GraphQL over HTTP is counter-steering that a bit, and it's going to have more quote-unquote approved options. But there are already multiple options in that one spec. So we're going to get to a point where you just want to write your API, but you want all of these good things. You want all of these features in some form or another. Maybe not the full thing, but you want to try them out. So that's what excited me at the time, that from a technical perspective, this is basically an unbounded space, and this unbounded space is completely unexplored.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think
anecdotally, it's also important to say that at the time you were messaging me and you were saying, "Hey, we should chat about GraphCDN," and I was just like, "Yes, we should chat about it. It's very interesting." And I don't know. You must have thought either I was a very hard negotiator or just very dense. I assure you, I was very dense.
I assure you, I did not think that. But I also knew from our conversations that you were quite happy at Formidable, right? And they're obviously have a great reputation in the community as being a great place to work. Obviously, every company has its ups and downs, but they have a reputation for really being at the forefront and pushing the open source forward. And so I wasn't surprised to find out that you hadn't considered leaving before I reached out and was like, "Hey, do you not want to work on a GraphQL CDN full time?"
Yeah, I think in part it was actually tough leaving. And as someone who has left, I think, more jobs than the average engineer, well, it depends on where you live. I think in London it could be quite normal that you've only worked in some companies half a year and then a year. You know, that stuff, this kind of high pace of switching jobs, not unusual. But when I joined Formidable, I was there from mid 2017 all the way till mid last year. So it was a long time. And I think that is the easiest way for me to say this was a really long time and unusual for myself. This was like the first job where I really stayed and stuck around. And that was because of stereotypical answer here, the culture that the company has built. But it's really easy to say, blah, the culture here, the culture that. It was really just about caring about people, giving a shit about how the company's run. And then when I talked with you, I was still not very convinced that I would find a job that was right for me. But it was when I was then talking to Tim, because I remember we didn't talk a lot because we know each other, bias. When I was talking to Tim, he was basically echoing these same opinions about company building that I've kind of developed over my time at Formidable. And that's when I thought, yeah, that's true. You can just build another company that works that way, right? It sounds silly, but you can just do that again, right? It's not unique. Well, in a way, emotionally speaking, it's unique, but these kind of mechanisms, they have to work somewhere else as well, right? Otherwise, the world would be pretty bleak.
I agree. I think it's really unusual for particularly an early stage startup to care this much about the people that work there. And I think that's one of, I would say, Tim and my core values. And I've recently had this big realization that everything just flows from our values, right? All the people we've hired, all of how the company works just flows from what do Tim and I care about? What do we both value at the very core of our people, of our beings? And the one thing I would say that is like the main value that we share is that we really put the people first. We have a very strong belief that if we can just hire the best people and put them into an environment where they can do their best work, we're going to be successful, right? Or at least our chances of success are much, much higher than they would be otherwise. And so to us, it was like a no-brainer, right? Of course, we're going to treat our people well. We got to do that. Otherwise, they're just going to leave again, right? That would defeat the whole point. And I'm glad to hear that that resonated with you and caused you to consider leaving and joining an early stage startup, which was a little bit scary, it sounded like, based on your previous experiences with early stage startups that maybe were a little bit more chaotic.
Yeah, I mean, chaotic is relative. I don't have a zombie apocalypse shelter, but that's not the kind of fear we're talking about, right? It's just, I think when I would advise, what I would advise to people who are looking to join startups is still a healthy dose of skepticism. And I suppose even when I was joining the company before Formidable Trainline, I talked to other companies at the time. And it's very hard to also find a company that just works for you in terms of the vibe. And when you're like checking off just the vibe, that's a big thing, right? I'm not even talking about, okay, how do they treat people? What are their ambitions? But if you find trust in people there, then that gets you always a long way, right? Because you want to find quote unquote allies there already when you interview, right? You want to find not people that are like-minded, but people that you know will have your back, right? And that will work towards improvements. So I don't know if the advice is anything. Of course, you gotta have a bar that a company has to pass for you to join. But apart from that, that bar is useless if you're not looking for that commitment to improve. And you find people that are basically making this kind of implicit promise to you, we're going to improve.
I think that's really powerful. I think that's one of the things that I'm the most proud of about Grafsteden. One of our other, I think, Tim and my core values is just, we're here to learn. We don't know everything. We're figuring it out as we go, but we're learning and we're trying our best to learn as fast as we can. And it feels to me like every single week Grafsteden is a different company, or every single month, when I look back to where we were 6 months ago, right? Which seems like a pretty short amount of time. We were a wholly different company. Barely any people had joined. We didn't have any processes in place. We were just starting to figure things out. But even when I look back last week or 2 weeks ago before our last offsite, we were a totally different company, right? We're connected in totally different ways. And so it feels like just every week we're continuously getting better. And that makes me really excited about the company, because if we can keep that rate of learning, if we can keep that rate of getting better, we're going to be extremely great at what we do. Like as a team, right? Everybody at the company is going to be extremely great at what they do, even better than they already are. And then we can achieve really big things together.
Yeah, it's really interesting that I actually was just thinking yesterday, because we just came back from the offsite, right? I was thinking, wow, every day we're kind of learning. And that was, everything just felt so fast at the offsite as well, because we're actively working in sessions to talk about our values, to talk about how we want to work every single time. But we're also making improvements every day. It starts as little as like talking about, well, we've posted this question, and then we're working on answering it. Like, how can we do that better next time? Or we were just in this meeting, we're talking about, well, can we just change the order of this slightly? Like, of course, every company and every team iterates. But I think if we had like a kind of streak of making something better every day in terms of the teamwork, I think right now we're doing pretty well. Can't tell you how many days in a row we've done it, but I think we're doing pretty good.
I feel like it's quite a lot. When you look back, to the moment you were like, when I first reached out and you were like, I could actually consider joining here. Now you've been here a little bit more than 6 months. I think you joined last August, if I remember quickly. Man, time flies. It's already 8 months now. When you look back on the last 8 months, what would you say stuck out to you as having worked really well. But also, of course, again, like you said, we don't want to just talk about what's going really well in this best company ever, right? Like, we're not perfect and we're far from it. What do you think is something that stuck out to you, something that really didn't work very well, that we still have to improve, or that we did improve?
I think we're really good at ideas. I feel like constantly we have so many ideas just stacked up. It's like a queue. It's like a queue that's always behind us. We all know we have a huge kind of stack of papers with like all of these ideas lying around. Half of them written down, half of them not, and the list varies for each person. And we can't even do like half of these things, technically speaking and time speaking. We can't do them. But a huge amount of these ideas we come back to, we realize, wow, we had a good hunch there. And it happens again and again. We're building new features that we don't have to talk about now. But I think just a few days ago, we implemented something. I'm like thinking, yeah, we talked about that 4 months ago. And like we had this small thing, this small change that we now want to ship out. And I was just thinking, yeah, Andy talked about that a couple of months ago. And like it happens every single time. Not to say that we're talking about features that we've scheduled and it's taking a long time to get to. Sometimes it's like these shifts, these slight shifts in how we do things that we already were chatting about months ago. Not to say that we're also looking into the future or that we're super smart or anything, but I feel like we're just so open and iterative. And I think that comes from that unbounded space, right? There's so much that's unexplored. There's going to be a lot of obvious stuff that just hasn't been done yet. There's going to be a lot of cool, obvious stuff that is going to deliver exponentially more values than what it looks like, just because this is a new space that people haven't really explored yet. And our particular position in it strategically works quite well. Lots of interesting things. And I think that is going really well. We're really good at coming back to these things. We have a really nice path. So one of these things where in a year or two bird's eye view, it's going to look like, yeah, obviously we did it this way. We went left, we went right, and then we went down to the next block and we turned left. Like we have this route in our head, and if we're going to look at it, it's going to feel like, duh, super obvious. But right now, we're basically just taking it turn by turn. Turn by turn, we have these destinations we want to get to, this bigger roadmap, the bigger ideas. But right now, we're taking it turn by turn. And I think that's really working well. So I think our teamwork really enables us to do that. And I mean, we can't lie, there's been friction, there's been ups and downs, because this is hard, right? We're talking about these things all the time, and it takes a lot out of us. And that's why it's so important to care about how things are going. And that's why I'd say we can still improve, right? We can still be a bit better at, okay, maybe planning 2 or 3 turns ahead is going to do us some good. I think right now we're just finding out we're not enough people just yet to plan a bit far ahead. It's like you're driving in fog, right? Whereas in the future, you just have a large group of people walking down the street and everyone's looking at something different. Someone's looking at, I don't know, the windows to the clothing store next door. Someone's looking at lunch. It's like a large group of people walking down the street. They're going to see a lot more. They're going to see so much further ahead than just that one person that doesn't know where they're going.
I absolutely agree. I think if I had to summarize what you just said, I would say Tim and I, we really felt this problem of GraphQL caching ourselves. We really needed this product that we've now built ourselves with the last companies and products we've built. And now that we've built this, we're starting to like, sort of like in video games, right? Like we're starting to uncover the fog of war, and we're starting to realize, holy shit, there is so many unsolved problems here that people haven't even started looking into. There's so many ideas we have because we all, the engineering team knows GraphQL really well. We know GraphQL really well. We're like very GraphQL centric, and we're starting to realize, oh my God, there's like this idea that would be really valuable for people. There's this problem that we could solve for people. There's that what we could do. And it's like, the space is so huge, the opportunity is so big. And we're just like, okay, wait, hold on. What do we even do next, right? Like there's so many options. We kind of got to pick and choose, and we got to be like, okay, what do we focus on first? It's not even what are we going to do. It's like, what are we going to do first? And then what are we going to do next? And like you said, I think that's a huge opportunity for us, right? That's what gets me up every day. It's like looking at that opportunity ahead and going, okay, in 1 year, in 2 years, so much of this is going to exist. But how do we structure this, right? What are the next 3 turns or 4 turns or 5 turns that we're going to make? We don't know that, because every day we wake up and we're like, oh, hold on, so we just learned this thing, we just learned that thing, a customer told us about this problem that we could totally solve. Oh yeah, I heard something similar over there. And it's like we kind of just gotta get our ducks in a row, right? We gotta just be more people. We're a tiny team right now, as Sue likes to say, we're the mightiest team of 9 right now that's out there. And we just gotta be more people, because there's so much to do. And when I think about the future of, where we're gonna be in 2 years, I'm so excited, and I just want to get there sooner. I want to get there as soon as possible, so that we can help all of our customers with all of these huge problems that they're facing.
Yes. I don't know what to say about that. No, I think
That was
you hit the mark perfectly, right? It's we're a small team and we have all of these ambitions, and at the same time, there's this kind of balance. We have so many difficult balances we have to just hold right now for just a bit longer to be able to do these things, and then we know things are going to speed up rapidly. As soon as we have more engineers joining, things are going to speed up, because we're going to be able to get to these ideas. We're going to be able to go back and do the things we couldn't do before. And it's silly to say that as an engineer, or in engineering, we know, wow, we have to do this, so we can do that, so we can do that, so we can do that. Like, there's so many technical, smaller things that aren't even challenges, that are just sequencing that you have to do. So it feels sometimes like you're just playing a game of whack-a-mole. And at the end, you get your new high score, and then you're like, okay, next game. But really, it's every one of these turns takes a couple of steps, and everything kind of is going at a slower pace, I think, than we can envision already. And that is, I think, our difficulty, right? It's also the headspace of like knowing, well, we have all of these things, but there's no way we can get to all of them. I think that is the most difficult thing right now, just in general, personally for me. Just knowing, oh, once we do this thing, this is going to be so great, but we're just not there yet.
This lets me segue perfectly into the one last thing I wanted to say before we end this podcast, which is we're hiring across the board. If you're an engineer listening to this, if you are in design, if you are in ops, if you are in marketing, sales, whatever, we're hiring across the board. We need way more people. What Phil just said is basically we have a huge opportunity ahead of us, but we need more people in order to get there faster. And so if any of this sounded interesting to you at all, if you've been listening to this whole podcast, reach out to us. Go to graphcdn.io/careers, our careers page. Even if you don't see a position on there that suits what you can do, send us an email. Shoot over an email. Just contact us and tell us what do you think you can do, what your skill set is, and how you can help, and why you're excited about GraphCDN. We would love to hear from you. Even if we don't have a role right now that fits your skill set, then we know you exist. And then when we do end up opening a role for your skill set, we can go back and we can be like, that person reached out a while ago. We should probably ping them first. So hit us up, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. We really need more people. And so just get in touch, right? Thank you, Phil, for taking the time to chat with me today. That was an incredible overview over a lot of different topics. We went really deep on the technical things, and we went really deep on the culture things. We've covered a lot. Thank you so much for taking the time. I hope everybody learned something. If you want to go follow Phil, Phil Plu ckthun is on Twitter. I think that's your main social network, I would probably say, @_PhilPL. Thank you so much for joining, and I will see you all in the next episode.
Thank you. That was a lot of fun. Cheers.